Good morning, I'm Ann Schindler, and this is First Coast Connect. Today, a plan to restore 24 1920s-era bungalows in a historic Black neighborhood. We talked to the project's developer about why he got involved and what he hopes it will become. Then, our election coverage continues as we're joined by Duval County School Board District 7 candidate Sarah Mannion. And we talked to the curator of Street Art History 101, a brief education on the evolution of graffiti. Join the conversation. Give us a call at 904-549-2937 or email firstcoastconnect@wjct.org. You can also tag us on Facebook, Instagram, or X. It's all ahead this hour after the day's news.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Corva Coleman. Tropical Storm Debbie is creating a massive flooding threat in the southeast. It could pour up to 30 inches of rain on some parts of Georgia and South Carolina. National Hurricane Center specialist Richard Pash says Debbie is slowing down.
The maximum winds are down to 45 miles per hour. I think it'll weaken a little bit more here, or certainly not strengthen during the day. We expect the center to move out over the water, at least temporarily here off the Georgia and South Carolina coast, and then move back inland within a couple of days. So it could re-strengthen.
The storm has left at least 5 people dead. 4 of them perished in Florida, where Debbie made landfall yesterday as a hurricane. Vice President Harris is expected to name her running mate today to the Democratic presidential ticket. She'll appear with her choice later today at a rally in Philadelphia. Some names talked about include Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro, Arizona Senator Mark Kelly, and Minnesota Governor Tim Walz. It's state primary election day today in Kansas, Michigan, Missouri, and Washington State. In Missouri, St. Louis Public Radio's Jason Rosenbaum reports Democratic residents in St. Louis will decide whether to back Congresswoman Cori Bush or turn to her well-funded challenger.
Bush took part in the Ferguson protest movement before getting elected to the House in 2020. But her criticism of Israel's military actions in Gaza prompted pro-Israel groups to spend millions to help her primary opponent, St. Louis County Prosecutor Wesley Bell. Bell says Bush is out of touch and not delivering for the St. Louis-based district.
My agenda has always been the interests of this region.
Bush, though, contends her vocal support for a ceasefire in Gaza is popular with Democratic voters.
And so regardless of how much it hurts, you have to do what you've been called to do.
The Bush-Bell contest is one of the most expensive primaries of the year, with most third-party support going to boost Bell. For NPR News, I'm Jason Rosenbaum in St. Louis.
A rocket attack on a main U.S. military base yesterday in Iraq has wounded several military personnel. That is according to the Pentagon. NPR's Jane Araf has more from Beirut, Lebanon.
A Pentagon official said several personnel were wounded in the attack on Monday. Iraqi security officials said 2 rockets fired from a truck-mounted launcher landed inside Iraq's Ain al-Assad base in western Al-Anbar, where U.S. forces are stationed. A previously unknown group announced the attack on a Telegram channel, indicating a possible split between Iran-backed militias in Iraq. The biggest Iran-backed groups agreed with the Iraqi government to pause attacks on U.S. targets, while Iraq negotiates a U.S. troop withdrawal. The Iraqi government issued a rare statement calling the attack reckless. Jane Araf, NPR News, Beirut.
You're listening to NPR News from Washington.
This is WJCT News 89.9 in Jacksonville. Yesterday, Debbie made landfall at the Big Bend region of our state as a Category 1 hurricane. The storm produced heavy rainfall across much of the peninsula's Gulf Coast and several tornado warnings over coastal and interior parts of the peninsula, including areas here around Jacksonville. Now, Tropical Storm Debbie's heavy rain has pushed out of Florida into Georgia and South Carolina. Meteorologist Megan Borowski from the Florida Public Radio Emergency Network says that residual impacts are coming today.
So historic rainfall is occurring over Georgia and South Carolina, and because the forward speed of Debbie is slow, this heavy rainfall will continue over these states for the next few days. Parts of Florida could still experience outer bands today around the periphery of Debbie's circulation, and any additional heavy rain from those could produce more flooding, but that threat should be isolated. Something now that we need to monitor are river levels, especially in North Florida. These waterways will be overwhelmed with drainage from yesterday's rain over Florida and also the ongoing rainfall over southeast Georgia.
And Megan reminds us that floodwaters can pose many threats and never wade through or enter these waters. Police are investigating an apparent accidental drowning after a woman's body was found Monday morning in a pond in Mandarin. Officers were called out to the pond on Old St. Augustine Road just after 7 in the morning. Foul play is not suspected. Continued stormy and windy conditions. Windy from the southwest today, rain, and it is raining now in Jacksonville.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include Insperity, providing HR services and technology, from payroll, benefits, and HR compliance to talent development. Learn more at Insperity.com/HR Matters. And the Doris Duke Foundation.
Rehabbing the historic bungalows of Oneida Court. We sit down with the project's developer about why he's focused on restoring this part of the Mixon Town community and what he hopes to save. Later in the program, our election coverage continues with Duval County School Board District 7 candidate Sarah Mannion. But first, 24 brightly colored bungalows are the focus of a redevelopment project in an area once known as West Lewisville. To talk about why he got involved and what he hopes to accomplish is project developer Spencer Fletcher. Good morning, Spencer.
Good morning.
Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So this project was recently featured in a profile in the Florida Times-Union, which is how I'd heard about it. But for people who haven't heard of Oneida Court bungalows or even possibly the neighborhood known as West Lewisville, where are we talking about?
Best way to describe it is it's west of Brooklyn and right north of Riverside. It's a small pocket, maybe only 10 blocks by 10 blocks, and it's one of the oldest African-American neighborhoods platted in the city of Jacksonville sometime in the 1870s.
And it was the second oldest, you say, just after La Villa?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And so how did you learn about these bungalows in Oneida Court?
They were sort of blocked from the street. There was a tree line. There was a lot of garbage and debris that sort of kept you from seeing the houses. And I was exploring the area and, sort of prided myself in knowing a lot of the neighborhoods and the buildings and the houses and things. And totally surprised when I came across them and just enamored by them. You wouldn't believe the feeling, when you see this thing. This is too cool. It's a diamond in the rough,
Yeah. And so this neighborhood, for people who aren't as familiar as you, it's a neighborhood that was basically cut off during the construction of two main highways, I-10 and I-95. And this is sort of northwest of the intersection of those two interstates.
Yes, ma'am. Yeah, and it was a reasonably small neighborhood, and it bordered Riverside and Brooklyn. Obviously, people in Riverside don't even know it exists, and a lot of people in Brooklyn don't know it exists either because the interstate basically blocked it, and consumed a lot of land in the neighborhood as well.
Yeah. And so these homes there was originally 27 or 28 of them, is that right?
29, I believe. I counted 29 in the photograph here. I believe the photograph was taken sometime in the late 40s.
An aerial photograph you've got there, yeah.
Yes, ma'am. Yeah, and we know that about 5 have burned down of the originals.
So how do the math for me. There's 24 left.
29, 24 left, originally 29.
Okay. So how did you talk about being familiar with this neighborhood. What kind of line of work are you in that led you to become exploring even in these areas?
We do a lot of historic renovation. Paint contractor, was previously in the Navy. I got out and started the paint contracting company, and we primarily focus on historic renovations. So we sort of fix in the older communities, Riverside, Avondale, Mixon Town, Springfield, parts of downtown, San Marco, et cetera.
I think it's interesting. This bungalow court is one of 3 that are featured in Wayne Wood's book, Jacksonville's Architectural Heritage, which is a real treasure for anybody interested in the history and the architecture of the city. But it is part of what he describes as a bungalow court craze that started in Southern California, but it was these communities that are kind of facing in on themselves without a street separating the houses. So they're almost like a little commune of sorts.
It's sort of an interesting concept. And you sort of talk to a lot of the neighborhood folks here that have been there for a long time. And you sort of come to the realization that this was a sort of the epicenter of the community here, that you had this little promenade down the middle there, and everybody's friendly. Everybody lives in the same development. And you hear stories about the West Lewisville school that was just right next door, and how the kids would come out and come talk to the neighbors there. And it was a very vibrant, colorful community, pre-interstate, ash incinerator abatement.
These homes are bungalows. They all have, I think, they're about 800 square feet. They've got a couple of bedrooms, one bath, but they all have a front porch, which is a defining characteristic of that neighborhood.
Front porch, they're very ergonomical. They're very pleasant. They're very nice. The only thing that I'd say probably would have been tough to live without was electricity. They did not have electricity when they were built in the mid-1920s. They had oil-burning heaters in each room and in the bedroom, in the living room, rather. But nice layouts, 2-bedroom, 1 bath.
And you brought up an example of a kerosene can here in the studio for people who are watching on YouTube or on Facebook. We will try to get a shot of that up so that you can see it, but describe what we're looking at in this kerosene can.
We found a handful of these underneath the houses, and there was 2 chimneys. There was an open fireplace in the living room, and then a flue in both bedrooms, and that was their heat. These standard oil kerosene cans were common in all the houses at one time, and that's how they would refill these potbelly stoves, and they would heat the houses with them.
So you are currently working out of a former gas station that's right in that same neighborhood. Is that right?
Correct, yeah. In fact, the gas station was part of the original development. So they built the gas station in 1925 along with the houses. The developer had their gas station business there, and they had a large billboard in the field next to the gas station, but it was all part of the same development.
Okay. And so your painting company, your restoration and painting company is based out of there now?
Yeah, we're based out of there now, and we use the warehouse space for sort of a staging ground for material and things for the houses.
So we are talking, if you're just joining us, with Spencer Fletcher. He is a developer, a redeveloper in this case, of the Oneida Court Bungalows. It is a historic Black community once known as West Lewisville, and you are welcome to join our conversation. You can give us a call at 904-549-2937, or you can email us at firstcoastconnect@wjct.org. So you alluded to the history of the ash sites a little bit, and I just want to dial back to that. Not everybody would be familiar with the history of ash sites. They were incinerator sites that burned garbage and produced some really toxic byproducts. How did that history impact these bungalows?
I would say pretty negatively. The ash incinerator is located right next to Forest Park, which was the community park there, and it operated from somewhere around 1899 to the early 1960s. And the only paved road in the neighborhood was a small section of Forest Street and then Edison Avenue. So that was one of your major thoroughfares through the neighborhood for all the communities in the surrounding area. And so the remainder of the roads were dirt roads. You can imagine there's a lot of dirt roads or gravel roads. And they would take the ash, the byproduct of the incinerator, and they would dump it on the roads. And they send a truck behind them with burnt motor oil, and they would spray it to keep the dust from coming up. But the issue with the ash.
That's how they would pave the roads.
That's it. Yeah, that's what they would. And they would dump it in people's front yards, which is pretty common, to build up areas when they were developing, and they used as base material for construction of other houses that were built in the neighborhood in that era.
So the impact isn't from ash flying out of a chimney. It's literally from being accumulated and dumped around neighborhoods.
For, close to 60 years, it was dumped all over the neighborhood.
So how do you feel about the relative safety of the properties in terms of, I know that they've been doing remediation in some neighborhoods to try to make up for the presence of some of this ash?
Yeah, I think, I've spoken with the city about it, and I know they have a couple of additional phases of the project. I think on this particular Oneida Bungalow Court, when they did the sampling, there wasn't a lot of ash abatement to be done on the property, which was a surprise because a lot of the surrounding properties did. But another little interesting piece of history there is that when they built the development, you notice the block is a lot larger than the other blocks. Well, originally it was cut in half by a street, and the street was MacArthur Street. And the developer made a deal with the city to close the street in order to build the development. And that was the only area that they found areas of ash because that's where they paved the street. So I think the city came in and abated all that sometime in the early 2000s. It was a major project, and it certainly led to some of the decline in the neighborhood.
So tell us a little bit about yourself. You are from LaBelle, Florida. I've been to Clewiston. I've been to Belglade. This is just west of there, kind of in the middle of nowhere in a lot of ways.
Middle of nowhere. It's a farming community, and even me, I grew up outside of LaBelle, sort of in between LaBelle and Felda, but very small, one horse town.
Mm-hmm. And your father was a pilot?
Pilot, he's a crop duster and aerial applicator, did that his whole life.
And you also went into the military.
Yes, ma'am.
Were you a pilot as well?
I was, yeah. I flew P-8s for the Navy.
Okay. And then you got out of the Navy here in Jacksonville?
Yes, ma'am. Just about 3 or 4 months ago, actually.
Oh, wow. Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you.
So were you running this business in tandem with your service?
Sort of towards the end, yeah.
Okay.
I was.
What made you decide to take on a project this large?
You'd have to see it to believe it. You know what I mean? When you drive past, it's really hard to articulate in words the feeling you get. But the best way I can describe it is you're like walking back in time. And, this is a common thread among a lot of neighborhoods in the United States right now, that there are communities that don't get the attention that a lot of other communities do, predominantly minority communities. And there's a lot of good and rich history there. There's a lot of good and bad, and it deserves to be preserved, And when you drive by this place, it's one of one. I mean, really, when you look at it, it's just amazing.
So we have a question from Richard on Facebook, and it's a point that I wanted to get to as well. He's asking, what is happening to the existing residents of these homes? Some are occupied, some, as you said, were destroyed, but there are residents still,
Correct. Yeah.
tenants there.
Yep. Yeah, the tenants. There's a couple there that are long-term tenants, and we're going to make whatever plans we can to ensure that they're there as long as they want to be there.
They're currently renters, so you're their
Correct.
landlord, and the other properties are being renovated?
Well, we don't have really the funding to do everything at once. We've semi-completed one house. If you can imagine, 24 houses, a pretty massive undertaking. So right now we have, I'm going to say, about 10 vacancies, and one of them that had pretty major fire damage about a year and a half ago, or a year ago maybe.
Yeah, I saw a photo of it. It really is burned.
Yeah, it is, yeah. I just signed paperwork to have a contractor come in and reframe it so that the city can't tear it down.
What about the fact, I mean, this is a historic Black neighborhood, as we've talked about. You are, by appearances, a white person. Is there a racial dynamic to coming into a neighborhood with that history and taking it, buying it and redeveloping it?
I think it's all of my interactions. I'm locally, active in the local CDC there, and everything that
CDC is the Community Development.
Yes, ma'am.
Just Community Development Corporation.
Corporation. That's
Okay.
right. Correct, ma'am. And I'm active in that, and all the reception I've got over there has been overwhelmingly positive. There was 2 futures for this place. The previous owner had some interest. He was aging out. He unfortunately passed away about a week and a half ago, and he knew that the time to sell was coming up for him. And there was a good handful of other interested parties, and everybody had plans to raise the property.
Mm-hmm. We've got a call from Charles on the west side. Good morning, Charles. Go ahead.
Good morning. I have seen bungalows in the Hollywood Hills in L.A., and I've seen, some of the houses on Park Street, some of the larger single-family dwellings I've heard referred to bungalows. Could you please describe to me what the archetypal bungalow is? I mean, a single-family dwelling that has what architectural features to make it a bungalow?
All right. Good question, Charles.
Yeah, I would say if you're comparing it to something in Riverside here, a better way to describe it would be like shotgun houses or row houses. I call them bungalows because the house is sort of split in half. You have 2 bedrooms on one side, living room and kitchen on the other side. So it's not, sort of in the middle, if you may. So a shotgun house, traditionally, you got the hallway down the middle and all the rooms to the right or to the left. This probably more resembles a row house or a shotgun house than it does a bungalow.
I think of them as having, by necessity, a front porch.
Correct. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
So there are a couple of other remaining communities like Oneida Court. There is Dancy Street, which is in Springfield, and those are, I would say, much more specifically like shotgun homes. Is that true?
Yeah, and they're the makeup's a little different too. They had a promenade down the middle, which is similar. I think there are also 24 houses. They're off Main Street. The houses are a little bit larger, and there's more of a holiday in between the houses. So the houses,
more of a holiday.
So the gap in between houses here at the United Bungalow Court, they're built eave to eave. Like they mentioned in one of the news articles, if you wanted to shake your neighbor's hand through the window, you could. Whereas the other one, they separated the houses by a pretty significant distance.
These homes in Dancy Terrace, I think, are the same experience that you had when you discovered Oneida Court. If you just happen upon it and you've never seen it, it's actually right behind the KFC on Main Street. So if you go back behind there, you'll come across Dancy Terrace, and you really do feel like you've come to a very special, magical place. They're so unique. What is so appealing about them, do you think?
I don't know. Like I said, it's very difficult to describe, and I encourage anybody that wants to come visit, you're more than welcome to. But when you walk down the road there, it really takes you back in time. You're thinking of the struggles, the happiness, the sadness, all the blood, sweat, and tears that have been shed in those places for 100 years. And it just, you got the clotheslines behind the houses still. When you walk down there, you feel like you're in a movie set sometimes.
Yeah, it is a interesting history that's passed along, and I wish I could think of the quote that Wayne Wood. It's along the lines. It's in his book, but it's something to do with you cannot ever really own this house. It belongs to the people that came before you.
Yeah, and I think it's like a good way to describe it is we're just stewards of this stuff, and that my job here is to protect and save, and then someone else is going to take it over after that.
So, what kind of history remains for you to, help tell the story of this place? You've found an old aerial photograph that shows the property before the interstates came through and severed it from the rest of the community. But what else remains in terms of documentary evidence or records that show its history?
I don't have a whole lot. And I've noticed that finding stuff in other neighborhoods of the city of Jacksonville, like downtown or Riverside and Avondale, for instance, has been a lot easier to locate. But certainly I'll make a request out to your listeners that if they have some old photographs or documentation of West Lewisville, or particularly this bungalow court, I would be thrilled to add it.
The building that you took over and your business is run out of has a piece of history on it itself. It's got a mural of the first African American naval pilot, I believe.
Yes, ma'am. Yeah.
Can you tell us about him and also the story of that mural?
Sure. Ensign Jesse Brown, they just made a film about him. I believe it's called Devotion. But he has some history in Jacksonville. He went to flight school here. He lived here for some time during his flight training. He was the first African-American naval aviator, and he died in Korea in action.
And was the first African-American to die in that war.
Correct, yeah. Yes, ma'am.
So how did that mural come to be on the side of that building?
The movie came out. I'd known about the story a long time. That they have photographs of him up at the Building 1 of the U.S. Navy base, NAS Jacksonville, and he's always been a personal hero of mine. I love the story, and it really is heart-wrenching when you watch the movie and read the book. But I thought it was very fitting. He has a lot of history in Jacksonville. There's a lot of firsts in Jacksonville, and there's not a mural of him anywhere else in Jacksonville, and I thought it would be very fitting there.
And he also was a recipient of a Distinguished Flying Cross. Is that?
Yes, ma'am.
So
Yeah.
a fairly well-known name in naval circles.
Very well known, yes,
Yeah.
ma'am.
Somebody that you were familiar with from your own service.
Yes.
That's interesting. So what about this project in the end are those properties going to rent for or sell for? What is your plan? Are they going to be affordable housing? Who's going to be living there?
Yeah, we're going to have a portion of the project be affordable housing, and then I think the remainder of the houses we're going to keep at an affordable rate. Obviously, living over in Brooklyn, I'm sure a lot of people, if your listeners live over there, can attest that $2,000+ one-bedroom apartment is going to be tough to sustain if you're making anything less than $100,000 a year, which I don't think is sustainable for a lot of people.
Yeah, and Brooklyn is one of those neighborhoods that has been around a long time, has a lot of history, and has changed a great deal with redevelopment that has essentially pushed a lot of former residents out.
Yeah, a lot, and a lot of history has been wiped away. We had a lot of beautiful buildings there, beautiful housing that is all gone now.
The concern there, as in many of these neighborhoods, is what happens. Is this going to be a pattern where people are displaced? Is this gentrification? Is this going to supplant an existing neighborhood with an entirely different population of people?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that question. I know that, just in the block behind me, since I've been there, I'm going to say around 4 or 5 of the original houses have been torn down, and a new house has been put in its place and put up for rent. And for pretty significant amount of money too. So things are changing all around, and I think that the future of the property was in question. Mine specifically, because with as many teardowns and as many demolitions that have been happening over there, it's sort of sad.
We've got a call from Eric in Arlington. Good morning, Eric. Go ahead.
Yeah, I appreciate what you're doing, and congratulations on what you're doing. It's important. The reason this is important, that any neighborhood that existed before the automobilization, if you will, of America is important to preserve for a variety of reasons, and most importantly is that it's an example that we don't have to live this sort of suburban sprawl type thing. People did live another way and before, and it's important to preserve examples of that so people can see it. Say, look, we don't have to, if Florida has become one giant suburb, and it's just, we don't have to live this way with the cars and everything. So I appreciate what you're doing. Thank you for taking my call.
Thanks, Eric. This project, you think, would have ultimately been headed for a teardown of some kind if you had not been able to step in and take it over?
Absolutely would have, yeah. The previous owner voiced to me that all other interested parties had plans to raise the property, tear everything down.
And did he have a sense that he wanted it to continue, that was a priority of his?
He did, and in fact, that was one of the conditions, that just a verbal, but we shook hands on that, and he wanted to see him safe, and I certainly am going to make that happen. And it's very unfortunate timing because he'd have been thrilled to listen to this, but he passed away about a week and a half ago, 2 weeks.
Is there any designation for this neighborhood as historic? And I know that can cut both ways for someone working on a home. I'm sure you're familiar with that because you worked on a lot of historic homes.
Yeah, it certainly changes the guidelines, but we're still doing all the work that we would have been doing in Riverside and Avondale. We're still keeping to the guidelines that we would normally. And there is, we've had visits at the local CDC from the UF, discussing the options of maybe designating the neighborhood or maybe specifically the bungalow court. So, yeah, we're exploring that.
And when we talk about the restrictions, having a historic designation can limit how you can do construction, the kinds of materials you can use, sometimes how the exteriors can look. But there is also an opportunity for funding in some cases. Is that something that would be helpful to you?
Yeah, oh, absolutely, yeah. Yeah, any variety of funding would be helpful.
So are you pursuing anything either through the city or the state?
I'm pursuing some stuff through the city, but it sort of ended up in a dead end.
Why is that?
I don't really have a good answer for you. I think that a lot of the processes they have in place or are built for a large development company or a large firm that have a team of attorneys. So it doesn't really seem to make it achievable for somebody of my size. If that makes sense.
It's interesting. I mean, that is a kind of a stated priority of this mayor, is to allow for people like yourself to avail themselves of city services in a way that is helpful to them, but that's not been your experience.
No, not at all. In fact, for about a year and a half, I've been calling ad nauseum, to have the city come in and do some infrastructure upgrades in the neighborhood. The neighborhood never had sidewalks, with the exception of maybe Edison. Never had curbing, never had adequate stormwater drainage, never had street lighting in a lot of cases, or it was so old and antiquated or was broken. So there's a lot of major road work as well, a lot of major infrastructure problems in the neighborhood that haven't been dealt with, and probably because no one has called about them or bellyached about them. And of course, when I started, my thought was, well, this is a pretty important project. I think the city's going to get behind this and see that as well. And, maybe I'll be put in the queue. It may take a couple of years. I understand that. But to date, most of my requests have been canceled because they say it's over the work maintenance repair budget of $100,000. So basically we're at a stalemate. No one's budging.
How much is this project going to cost you overall, do you estimate?
Probably about $1.5 million.
Well, Spencer Fletcher, it's fun to meet you. It's a really neat project. Thank you so much for coming in today.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Up next, our election coverage continues. A conversation with School Board District 7 candidate Sarah Mannion. Welcome back. With 4 of 7 school board seats up for grabs, the future of the Duval County School District will largely be decided in the August 20th primary. Our coverage of that election continues today as we welcome Duval County School Board District 7 candidate Sarah Mannion. Good morning, Sarah.
Good morning, Ann. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you. And our listeners, you can join us as well. You can reach us on air with questions or comments by calling 904-549-2937, or you can email firstcoastconnect@wjct.org. So this is, Sarah, perhaps one of the most suburban school districts in the entirety of Duval County. It's Baymeadows and Mandarin area.
Yep. So Baymeadows, south side, and then south there all the way up to the St. Johns County line. So the little bit of Nocatee, that's in Duval County, E-Town, Bartram, all the way up to like the JTB line.
What are the challenges of that district, and why is it that you want to represent the people who live there?
Yeah, absolutely. So one, I'm from there. So I'm born and raised here. I lived in Mandarin my whole life, grew up off Joina Creek Road, closer to the Bartram side when it was just nothing but woods. There was one Jiffy store open out there. And so for me, it's home. The way that it looks and the way it's challenging is the growth that we've seen on the south side Baymeadows side is incredible. We have a lot of gated communities, a lot of apartment complexes on that side. So a lot of more, options for families to be there. On our Mandarin side, very much more suburban sprawl, a lot of older subdivisions, a lot of really old homes when you get to the Mandarin Road, Loretto side. But it's very, it's always been very family oriented. And so for me, it's really, not just where I grew up, but where I raise my family now. And it's just a really big sense of community that I feel there. And so for me, it's important to being from that community and being invested in that community, just wanting to make it, a better place and continue to ensure that our schools and our district, are the best that they can be.
And you have 3 kids. A couple of them have graduated from Mandarin schools. One of them is currently in a Mandarin school.
I've had one graduated from Mandarin High in 2023. I have a upcoming third grader starting next week at Mandarin Oaks. And I have a little one, he's 4, so he will start kindergarten the 2025 school year, also at Mandarin Oaks Elementary.
It's interesting because there are, I think, only 10 schools in the district.
Right.
None of them are on the closure list or the proposed closure list that we've been hearing about.
Yeah.
And I guess that speaks to just how different certain parts of town are in terms of the growth and the sustainability from a financial standpoint of the schools there. So this is a place where there's no shortage of students for these schools.
Correct. There's no shortage of students for those schools. And I think just looking at the size of these schools in comparison to some of the smaller schools that you see throughout the district, I mean, most schools, are very well utilized. Both Mandarin High and Atlantic Coast I think they've exceeded their capacity. I know Mandarin High is just starting construction on a new wing for their students there. And even, at my daughter's school, which is an elementary school, they've got about 1,000 students in that school. And so for an elementary school, it's very large, but it really has a very family feel. I mean, everybody knows everybody. So even though it's a bigger school, it still has a very big, community presence. And, a lot of our schools were built, more recently than some of the other schools in the district, with the exception of Loretto Elementary, which is one of the oldest schools in the district. But I feel like our schools are very desirable, and they have done a great job at, utilization and bringing students in, from the community.
So if you're elected and this issue is coming before the board, there are other board members who would be their districts would be greatly impacted by the possibility of closure. Does the fact that you wouldn't have schools on that list in some ways insulate you from those concerns? Or how will you approach the idea of these schools possibly being closed elsewhere?
Yeah, so I think, as a member of a board, right, even though you do represent your constituents, you are still one of 7 who has a voice, that covers all students in the district. So when we're looking at what, schools may be closed or may be consolidated, it's really important to me to ensure that we're really looking at the whole picture, that we have accurate data, and that we are really understanding the connections that the communities have to those schools. Some of those schools, that are on the list throughout the district are, an integral part of a community. It's walkable. They offer particular services that may not be available at other schools. So for me, it's really looking at the whole picture when we're looking at what schools may be closed or consolidated. So even though right now District 7 is not impacted, I think looking long term, just to where our trends are when we look at our funding sources and our enrollment, if those continue to trend downwards, those bigger schools do cost a lot to operate. So unless we get our whole district under control, it is possible in the future, we might have to make hard decisions that affect District 7.
The issue a lot of people have pointed to in terms of student population diminishing, especially in some of the older schools or schools that may or may not have had as robust an academic record, is the impact of vouchers and charter schools and money at the state level that's being directed towards those and away from traditional public education.
Mm-hmm.
So what is your feeling about working with alongside these challenges?
Yeah. And so I really feel that's one of the most important things the school board can do is advocate, for full funding of our public education institutions, because they're incredibly needed, throughout our whole community. And so, of course, at the school board level, the only thing that we can really control when we're looking at our revenue streams is enrollment. So right now, the money follows the child. And so if we are losing children from enrollment in our schools, we're losing that funding. So how can we be competitive and innovate in order to bring those children back into public schools and retain them there? And so that is really where the school board can focus, is looking at enrollment and being competitive and innovative. At the same time, we need to ensure that we are advocating and educating and informing our Duval delegation here in town to advocate for us in Tallahassee and try to bring some of those dollars back home. So District 7 is sort of interesting because we have a 1-to-1 charter ratio. And when you talk about we have, high enrollment in our schools, we do. And really charter schools in District 7 have been necessary to really sustain the growth, that we have there to ensure that every student has a place. And so when we're talking about the funding with charter schools, every parent, they're going to make decisions that are right for them and their family. But when we talk about charter schools and the funding, it's really more about transparency for everybody across the board and ensuring that, we're all part of the same playing field and that there's no unequal or uneven advantages.
So your opponent in this race is Ann Bolduc. She was scheduled to be on this show July 29th, and she had to cancel for appointments and hasn't rescheduled. We're still hopeful she'll come on. But how do you differentiate yourself from her?
So I am in it. So one, I am a proud product of our public school system. So like I said, I'm born and raised in Mandarin. I went through 3 schools in District 7, where we are now. And I went through Wolfson High School through the magnet program there. I am an attorney, so I practice real estate, bankruptcy, and probate law. And I think that where those skills are useful and where that sort of puts me in a unique situation is where we are with our funding issues, which I think is at the forefront of what we have to resolve as a school board. Because we talk about all the things that we want to do, like supporting teachers and paying them more and giving them better benefits and having more resources in our classroom. But if we are talking about closing schools, we're not having the money to do all of those things. So unless we resolve our funding issues first, we're really going to see sort of, the negative effects of that trickle down. So
you pointed out that you went to public schools here locally, and I think it's fair to say that she also went to Beauclair Elementary. She has 2 daughters at Mandarin High, so she has some similar connections.
Yes, she does. I think, I believe high school, she went to Bishop Kenny. And then I believe, she has a homeschool program. I believe her daughters were at Mandarin Oaks as well, because they live right in, the same neighborhood. And then I believe they were homeschooled for a while. And then now they are coming back to Mandarin High, which is wonderful.
Gotcha. We have a question from Susan on Facebook. She says, a mental health and anti-bullying program is on the school board agenda tonight. Mothers for Liberty supporters have spoken out against programs aimed at prevention and seem to want to rely on punishment as a deterrent to bad behavior. I guess that's as opposed to some sort of intervention. She wants you to talk about mental health and prevention of bullying.
Yeah. So one of the things I do is I serve as a volunteer judge for our Duval County Teen Court program. And that program assists children aged 11 through 17 who are first-time offenders. And it is, it's a way to keep them out of the criminal justice system and a way to give them interventions that they may be needing. So really trying to identify if children are having issues, why are they having those issues? And how can we give them sort of the infrastructure and support, and peer support to understand what resources they need. So I think when we're looking at disciplinary actions with these students, which in some instances is needed, we also need to be looking at why are these children having these problems, what other resources or gaps are there that are not being filled in that need to be met. At the same time, also identifying and helping children understand really the effects of bullying and what that can do to a child and the child who's doing the bullying. I once had a case where it was a young lady and she was in trouble for fighting, and her mother spoke and said, she was fighting this girl who had been bullying her all year long, and we had gone to the administration multiple times and nothing had happened. And ended up that they decided, hey, we're going to leave the public school system and go to a different place because our needs weren't being met. And so I think as a school board, we really need to understand that bullying happens and it has really detrimental effects, for the students all across the board. And how are we, one, preventing that to start with and having a proactive approach, and then really how are we addressing it when it occurs? And so I think that mental health services around that is really important to ensure that students, not only who are being bullied, but who are also doing the bullying, are getting the resources that they need to sort of get to the underlying issues that's causing this behavior.
One of the reasons that counseling in schools has become a somewhat divisive or wedge issue is concerns that counseling is happening and parents aren't being involved. The question of parental involvement, and I believe that would be the objection, if there is, to expanding programs like that parents who are advocating for more parental involvement think that they should be apprised of what's happening if their child is experiencing a crisis. Where do you come down in terms of, where the school roles end and the parent's role begins?
Yeah. And I think, as a parent, that's important to me. I'm a very engaged parent. I'm, in my daughter's school all the time, helping with her classroom. And I was just there this morning serving breakfast to teachers. But I think it is, one, incredibly important for there to be really transparent communication channels between the school and the student. Parents should certainly be apprised if there is an incident that happens where the child may be referred to mental health counseling. I also think that we need to be mindful that any sort of mental health counseling needs to be based upon a system of trust. And a student may not be very trusting or forthcoming with a counselor if they think that every single thing they're going to say is going to make it back to their parent. Now, if there is an instance where, when we look at what mandatory reporting incidents may be, or if there is some indications of the student thinking of self-harm or some abuse going on, then those are situations where there needs to be very clear conversation so that everybody can come to the table and help this child. But for the child to really be vulnerable and be honest and get the help that they need to have that trust with that counselor in order to have those conversations.
There have been some very combative school board meetings of late here and elsewhere in the state. A lot of that has been focused on books and the removal of books from certain places, libraries or media centers or classrooms. What is your position on book removals?
I think it's a very slippery slope. I think that when we're removing books from classrooms, it's not sending a great message to children. And when we're struggling with our literacy rates, we need more books on shelves. We need books that are representative of children that they are excited to read. While I do understand that parents can have objections to certain material, I think that where the school board has done a decent job is ensuring that all the material that is in a school library, you can go to the school board's website, view what materials are available. And as a parent, you have the right to say, I don't want my child to check out these books. So I think as a parent, if you really want to be engaged and involved, go to the school library or look at the website and see what's available and what you object to or do not object to. I think that, of course, age-appropriate material is always what we need to keep in mind. We're not going to have, Toni Morrison books at the kindergarten classroom, but I think that we need to have age-appropriate materials in our classroom, and we also need to be sure that there's a really transparent process. And I think that was a lot of the fear that happened at the end of the 2023 school year when, books were just completely removed because teachers weren't sure what was okay, what was not okay. They don't want to get in trouble, so they just had to remove, books. I saw pictures of, teachers covering their classroom libraries with sheets and, tape and just ensuring their kids didn't have access. And when you visit your kid's classroom, not seeing any books on shelves is a really troubling thing.
Another big point of contention is diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. What is your position about curriculum in that vein being taught to students, or subject matter being taught to students in a way that explores diversity, equity, and inclusion perspectives?
Yeah. I think it's important to note that Duval County is a majority minority district. And so when we're looking at diversity, equity, and inclusion, this is what our student body population is. They are diverse, and these kids are very inclusive. And it's not just race, it could be disability. There's a lot of ways in which we can explore inclusivity in schools. But I think that when we are talking to children, ensuring that they feel recognized and represented is very important. And I feel like part of that is ensuring that the history that we're teaching is accurate history, to these children, because it's their story. It's all of our story. And it may not always be nice and pretty, but, we need to teach it all, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and ensure that everyone's story is being told.
And how are you equipped to deal with people who have very different perspectives from you? Undoubtedly, this will be a diverse school board once it's elected. The community is a very diverse place. How do you handle working with people that simply don't agree with you?
So I'm a lawyer. I do that every single day. And so it's really just trying to find what are those, ways that we can connect. What can we agree on? And sort of build from there. And it may be something small. It may be a small thing that we can agree on. Okay, well, let's work on that. See how we can solve the problem. Hey, we did that really well. What can we tackle next? So it's really trying to identify when there is so much divisiveness, there are certain things that we can agree on. And I know one thing that, I've heard discussed at school boards is when we talk about contracts and bidding processes and moving more things in-house. And that absolutely is something that we should be exploring. And I think that is a wonderful opportunity, to bridge that divide with some board members.
I just briefly want to touch on the teachers union, because we've seen some numbers recently that since state law changed that prohibits an automatic deduction of union dues from someone's paycheck, that membership in the teachers union has really cratered. What is your position on that, and what is your position on the role of the teachers union?
Yeah. So first thing I'd say, I'm endorsed by our teachers union, and I'm very, very glad to have their support. I think there is always a place for unions and collective bargaining, because I think when people band together to try and get better benefits and better working conditions, for workers, that usually results in a better workplace for everyone. I do understand from the legal perspective, why they said, hey, we can't have that automatic deduction. But I think that there needs to be more, efforts and just more collaboration, I think, between the school board and the teachers union to really try and work together to make things better for our teachers. And I think they may be in the beginning of their sort of bargaining process right now. And so, they're there representing teachers, and not just teachers, but paraprofessionals and staff. And they are, the bedrock of our school system, and we should be doing everything we can to support them.
Well, Sarah Mannion, candidate for District 7 School Board, thanks so much for being here today.
Art and Garden's new exhibition, Fabric of a Nation, American Quilt Stories, from the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, on view through September 29th. Visit cummermuseum.org for more information. WinGuard is a marketing and communications agency dedicated to creating share-worthy social content. From social strategy to content creation, you can tag them in today. More at wearewinguard.com.
On the next Fresh Air, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Caitlin Dickerson tells us about her trip with migrants through one of the most inhospitable terrains in the world, along the border of Colombia and Panama, called the Darien Gap. Nearly 500,000 migrants each year risk their lives to get to the other side in their attempt to ultimately get to the U.S. Join us
today at noon on WJCT News 89.9.
If young children were playing in a physical area that was this unsafe, we would take it down.
Who decides what should be accessible and how it's accessible on the internet?
A political storm is brewing over a bill to protect kids online. I'm Deborah Becker. Will the bill protect children or censor them? That's on the next On Point.
Today at 11 on WJCT News 89.9.
The price of airline tickets shot up in the past year.
Meanwhile, drivers experience high fuel costs and miles of traffic. Could high-speed rail be the future of travel in the U.S.? We explore the high-speed rail projects under construction and how faster trains could change transit forever. Next time on 1A.
Today, starting at 10 on WJCT News 89.9.
Welcome back. What was once a way for gangs to mark territories has evolved into an art form with few boundaries. Here to give us a brief primer on street art is author and artist Katie Yellow. Welcome, Katie.
Thanks so much. Good morning.
Good morning. Thanks for braving the rain and making it in today.
Pleasure to be here.
So you've described yourself as a graffiti scholar. How does one become a graffiti scholar?
Yeah, I figured this question would come. It's a title given. Scholar is someone who appreciates a subject area and writes heavily on it. So I've been writing, blogging, covering, and published a book on graffiti for almost 10 years now. I claim I know some of the most knowledge about Banksy in the world, but there are real experts who are dealing his art today. So I just read, write, and share great knowledge on the history of graffiti.
You mentioned Banksy. There are people in the world who don't know who that is, believe it or not. So explain to us who he is and why he's become such a legend in the graffiti community.
Yeah, so no one in the world knows who he is, according to legend, right?
Really, like his identity.
Correct. Yeah, he's an anonymous graffiti artist who's been practicing for about 20 years. He has just exploded this global art movement because he went from creating art in the street to the gavel dropping at art auction for tens of 20s of millions of dollars on his anonymous artworks. So he's a Bristol born. Well, he was born right outside of Bristol in the United Kingdom. And traveled the world to put up these stencil art pieces after being inspired by French stencil god, if you will, Blek Lerat. And he started a cultural phenomenon. People are obsessed with him, figuring out who he is, not knowing who he is, and following his works, which is interesting. He just released a piece a couple days ago, and it's the first time in a few months he's put out a piece of work.
And is there a piece that you can describe to people if they're trying to jog their memory that will remind them of what his work looks like?
Yeah, his most famous piece is called Balloon Girl. It's a little girl holding up a heart-shaped balloon, kind of looking out into it. And then his second most famous piece is called The Flower Thrower. It's got a couple other names. Love Bomber is one. And it's a gentleman kind of chucking a bouquet of flowers.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. He's a street artist. Recently, a museum opened in his name that he doesn't have any role in as far as anybody can tell, but it's in New York. How do you feel about him having a museum?
So I feel adamantly against anything that charges to view his artwork. And it's not that we don't know what he's behind. His Instagram certifies all of his projects and all of his dealings, and then his website, Pest Control, authenticates all of his pieces. So if there's an unsanctioned show, he'll let you know, and it's typically really clear if it's not endorsed by him, if there's a fee, or if it's hard to get to, because that was the whole point of his art, and the whole point of his practice is kind of break down the white walls, white wine of the art world.
Mm-hmm. How did you come to graffiti art yourself? You used to actually be an artist, a practicing graffiti artist?
I was a practicing mural painter.
Okay.
So I teach the difference between the three art forms, mural, street art, and graffiti. So I was a mural painter, painted my way through college, and then had a really formative moment when I realized that street artists needed managers, they needed funding, they needed project managers, talent agents. So I got into that world. And then I'm originally from New York. Graffiti was co-started out of Philadelphia and New York City in the South Bronx, where my family's from. So it's kind of right time, right place, growing up with the guys who invented this stuff.
Can you give us the nickel version of the difference between street art, graffiti, and murals?
Yep. It's the history and the tools. If you follow the history of muralism or muralissimo through the Mexican mural painters, the WPA projects in the early 1900s, they were large, beautiful works of art that were put on walls that typically spoke to the political and social atmosphere of a place. Graffiti was birthed in the late 1900s. It was quick, it was rebellious, it was typically associated with vandalism or illegal art creating, and then street art erupted from both of those things. They both have totally different histories, totally different artists, totally different tools.
And is street art, we think of things that are wheat pastes. Is
Exactly.
that what, is there a medium that street art works in that's consistent?
Yeah, so that's exactly it. Mural painters are using, rollers and paint sprayers and bucket paint to cover large surface areas. Street artists use those two techniques: wheat paste, which is like printing your work on a piece of paper and going out and pasting it up. Street artists need to be super quick. So another technique is stencil art. So yep, when you see a stencil art, a wheat paste, that's typically an aesthetic and tool that is related to a street artist.
So you have a workshop that is coming up on August 8th. That's this weekend in the Phoenix Art District, which itself is covered with graffiti and murals.
Perfect place.
Tell us just briefly how people can get involved and what you'll be talking about.
Yep. There's an Eventbrite link to get a ticket. It's a really small room. So there's only 40 people. We're almost filled up, but there are some spots left. You can either pay $1, pay 50, pay whatever you think it's worth. So I really appreciate that model. And I'm essentially going to give an hour and a half talk and really dig into the difference between mural, street art, and graffiti, those tools, those histories, what distinguishes them, and then talk about the journey of publishing this book that took me 3 years. And I got in the room with some people who you just can't get into the room with. So I just want to share those stories.
I'm going to hold up a picture of the book for people who are watching. Katie Yellow, thanks so much for being here. We appreciate it.
Thanks for
Connect is provided by Baptist Health and the North Florida TPO.
Baptist Health is a proud supporter of First Coast Connect. Baptist Health, committed to building a healthier community for all of us. More info at 202-4YOU or baptistjacks.com. Volunteers in Medicine has been providing health care for the working uninsured for over 20 years. With over 200 dedicated medical volunteers, Volunteers in Medicine operates clinics in West Jacks and South San Marco. We're committed to a healthier community. More at vimjacks.org. Life South Community Blood Centers, providing blood and patient services to the local hospitals, serving patients in this community. Donating blood with Life South helps save lives. More at lifesouth.org to find a blood drive near you.
This is WJCT News 89.9 in Jacksonville. Ahead in the next 5 minutes, live local news for the First Coast from the WJCT News team.